Hello, let's move on to 3.5, where we'll look at three of the four major tissue types: muscle, nervous, and epithelial. You will see one is missing. We'll do that one more in class. That one's a little more involved. But I wanted to focus on the major characteristics of these three tissue types, also considering the differences within them. For example, muscle has three subtypes, if you will: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. So we'll talk about the differences we're going to see within a tissue type. We'll look at where these tissues are found and what they do. So that's our quest here for this video. Let's start with muscle. Um, for each of these tissue types, you should have things sort of spring to your head. When you hear muscle or hear epithelial, you should focus on some of the major characteristics first. One of the biggest characteristics to focus on for muscle is that muscle is made of these long cells called muscle fibers. It's a little confusing, but a cell is a muscle fiber. And why that's important is that muscle fibers, muscle cells, muscle tissue can contract. That is, it can get shorter. That's important because we associate muscle tissue with movements. Whenever we need to move blood from one part of the heart to the other, or squeeze blood out of the heart, or we need to move an arm or move our jaw, we associate the contractile nature of muscle. It can pull, it can make something happen, it can push fluid out. Depending on the kind of muscle we're talking about, we get different kinds of motions or movements. Also notice that muscle is important for helping us maintain posture. It can generate heat. Whenever we shiver, we actually are going to be generating some heat from that muscle motion. So contractile cells are going to be the principal ingredient of muscle tissue. And we'll look at some of their anatomical differences as we consider the types below. So let's go ahead and label these. This is smooth muscle. This one, grab my mouse over here, this one is skeletal. And hopefully by process of elimination, you recognize that this one is cardiac muscle. So let's talk about each of these types in terms of anatomical differences as well as some of their physiologic differences. Let's start with smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is going to have the ability to regenerate. If smooth muscle is damaged, these cells can go through a mitotic process and produce more smooth muscle cells. That's great. We see differences between skeletal and cardiac, though. Cardiac and skeletal, neither of these can regenerate very well. So when these tissues are damaged, they don't generate a lot of new tissue the same way that smooth does. Now, there is some limited capacity, especially with skeletal, and you can produce new muscle fibers over time, though this is sort of controversial among physiologists. But cardiac especially, when cardiac muscle dies, it's not going to be replaced with new heart cells. And therefore, when someone suffers a heart attack, those cells are considered to be permanently dead, and there will be maybe some scar tissue in its place. Some other things to focus on here. Smooth muscle carries out wave-like contractions called peristalsis. Think about how your food is going to be moving through your digestive system as it moves from your small intestines to your large intestines, or even within these, even with the intestines, you have to have the food sort of squeezed from one location to another. Peristalsis are these wave-like contractions that we associate with smooth muscle. So in places of the body that we need to push things through in a wave-like motion, as food is moved from your esophagus to your stomach, or from your small intestines to your large intestines, as urine is pushed from through your ureters to your bladder, wherever you need to sort of push or have wave-like contractions, you're going to find a lot of smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle, obviously, we're going to associate with our limbs and with our, even places like our jaw and our eyes, areas where we have voluntary control over our muscles and our movement. So skeletal is the only of the three types that's voluntary. Smooth muscle is involuntary. We don't have to think about moving our food through our tracts. Cardiac, the heart, is obviously going to be involuntary. We don't have to think about moving our blood through or telling our heart to beat. So smooth and cardiac are involuntary. Skeletal is voluntary. Cardiac has sort of a special feature to it as well. Not only is it involuntary, but the nervous system doesn't control your heart rate. That is, your heart is going to beat on its own. The nervous system can influence it a little bit, but the heart has this property called automaticity that actually means that it can control its own firing and its own contractions. We'll talk about that more in A&P too. Before we move on, I want to touch on some brief anatomical differences that are visible in our views here. Notice that if you look very carefully, my pen got stuck. If you look very carefully, you'll see little tiny stripes in the skeletal muscle, and if you're looking really carefully, you might see some of those same stripes, some of those patterns in cardiac muscle. This is referred to as striation because of the pattern of actin and myosin, the proteins that make up muscle tissue. They're very obvious in cardiac and skeletal. They're not obvious in smooth, even though actin and myosin are in there. So the striated muscles are considered the skeletal and the cardiac because of the striped appearance of these muscles. You also can notice in cardiac muscle how we have branching. We have different cells. You kind of see this pattern of branching. We have another branch down here, another branch here. This branch is pretty obvious. So we have branching in cardiac muscles that you don't see in the other muscle types, and that makes them somewhat unique. And one other feature to mention about cardiac, notice how we have these areas here. Here's one, I'm drawing it. I'll sort of circle this one. I'll circle this one right here. We have areas where the muscle cells join together, and these are referred to as intercalated discs. Let me type that one up for you. Intercalated. Sorry. Intercalated discs. These are areas where the cells sort of knit together. There's some special reinforcing regions of these cells. There's also some gap junctions, so ions flow back and forth between them, and that allows a coordination of contraction, especially important for the heart muscle. Great. Let's move on to, oops, get rid of this. Let's move on to nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is most associated with communication. For nervous tissue, we're talking about sending an electrical signal from one cell to another, from one body region to another, and the main cell type that does that within the nervous tissue are neurons. You see neurons down here, here's one over here, and you see them also here as these, I'll circle the cell body of one of them. You see them as these large cells. The neurons are the stars. They're the ones that send electrical information from one region to another, and they generally send it this way from the dendrite in through the cell body you see here to the axon end. So they always are sort of sending it from the dendrite to the cell body side of the neuron to the axon, and then what would be over here on this other end would be the dendrite of the next cell. So there is a signal pathway that the nerve impulses travel through from dendrite to cell body to axon. So neurons send electrical information. So then what do the neuroglial cells do? What do these things do? Neuroglial cells are support cells. They provide nutrition. They provide extra support in terms of metabolic assistance to the neurons so they can work. There's several kinds of neuroglial cells, and we'll talk about those when we get to the nervous system. But how I always think about it is neurons are the football players or the stars of the team. The neuroglial cells are the team managers. They're the assistant coaches. They're the people who work in the ticket office. They do all the things that help support the game, but they don't actually play the game. 98% of your nervous tissue actually is going to be in your brain and spinal cord. So most of your nervous tissue will be there. There will be some other locations that we'll talk about more when we get into the nervous system in class. Next up, epithelium. Whenever you think epithelium, again, what should sort of spring to your mind are some of its major functions. And epithelium has really, these as the major functions. It is a covering or lining. We associate this with sort of covering us wherever we interact with the environment, on our skin, inside our respiratory tract, inside our reproductive tracts. Wherever we have semi-contact with the environment or contact with the environment, we have to have some protection. And that's what epithelial tissue does. It also is going to be responsible for our glands, and we'll talk about that in just a couple slides from here. So epithelial tissue, again, just focus on the idea that it's going to be covering, lining, and glandular. When we talk about epithelial tissue, we have to recognize that epithelial tissue, in most cases, is going to have what's called a polarity. That is, it's going to have a difference in the tissue from one side to the other. Notice here, and it's a little misleading in this slide, so let's make sure we see the right thing here. When you're looking at this slide, epithelial tissue comes from right here up. So the part you're seeing down here is not epithelial. This is actually going to be connective tissue. This is a capillary, so that's vascular. So only focusing right here for right now, recognize that there's sort of two sides to epithelial tissue. There's a basement membrane that you can also see over here, and that's where it attaches to the underlying connective tissue. And then there's the side that's exposed to kind of the free surface to the environment. So if you're talking about the skin, the air is the free environment, and the part directly on top of our hands, for example, would be the apical surface. So the apical means either the top of or the part exposed to the lumen or space or cavity. The basement membrane is how it attaches. So epithelial is a little different because it does have polarity. Epithelia is also a little different because it's avascular. It does not have its own blood supply. So how does the tissue get fed, with nutrients and oxygen, etc.? Well, as you might imagine, if this is the basement membrane and this is the apical surface, and there's no close by blood supply, the nutrients have to diffuse, a term you're familiar with now, have to diffuse from the capillaries up through to the epithelial tissue. As you might imagine, the nutrients are going to get fewer and fewer the further you go away from the source. So that's why we associate the top layer, especially with skin, the stratum corneum, is dead, because all those are just composed of dead cells. There are no live cells on the stratum corneum. Nutrients can't go that far, cells gradually die, and therefore the top layer of our skin is dead. One more thing we'll focus on for epithelial tissue is that it's extremely mitotic. Since it's exposed to the environment, think about the inside of your stomach, for example. It's exposed every day to lots of acids and foods, and if you did not have a way of replacing the cells that get damaged and sloughed off and killed, then you'd be in trouble. So epithelial tissue in particular is extremely mitotic, and it regenerates very quickly. What happens when you get a scratch on your hand? It will heal relatively quickly because the epithelial cells will grow back together and heal that wound. This is also the reason, though, that people who are going through cancer therapy often lose their hair or are nauseous. Epithelial tissue is going to include hair. So when someone takes medications or has radiations to target fast-growing cells or fastly dividing cells like we see with cancer, any other cells in the body are also that grow fast are going to be targeted by these chemotherapeutic agents. So someone can lose their hair or become very nauseous because they will slough off some of their stomach lining, because those cells also regenerate very quickly. All right, let's then look at one of the things that makes epithelial tissue somewhat unique is how we name it. When we try to name epithelial tissue, we have to pay attention to several things. We'll start with the cell layers and the cell shape. when we have a term that we use whenever we want to talk about the cell layers. We refer to that as either simple or stratified. So if something is single cell, only has one layer thick, we refer to that as a simple epithelium. If it has multiple layers, as you see down here, we refer to that as a stratified epithelium, which means multiple layers. So one part of an epithelial name will refer to the number of layers. We also look at the cell shape as one way of naming epithelial tissue. And we're talking about the shape of the cells on the apical surface. If you look at this one, these cells are kind of, not really sure what this is. At the top here, we can actually look at these layers of cells, and we use that as the way we name it. For example, cells that have this flat-like, almost tile appearance to them are called squamous cells. Squamous means tile. Cuboidal cells are going to be those that are roughly the same height and width, roughly a square or a cube. So those are cuboidal. Those that have one long axis and then one short axis are referred to as columnar. So when we name tissue, again, epithelial tissue, we're going to include the cell layers, simple or stratified, and we'll also include cell shape. And we'll see some examples of that in a second. A couple of exceptions to this. Transitional epithelium, if you look at the bladder, for example, which contains transitional epithelium, depending on how full the bladder is, it can change the shape of the cells. So transitional actually appears to have multiple cell shapes in its apical surface, which gives it sort of a misleading morphology or shape depending upon how full the bladder is. And another term you may run into is pseudostratified. You may have a epithelial tissue that looks like it's multiple layers, but it's actually not. And you'll see an example of that in 1 second. And finally, one other term that we can throw into the naming of this is you may see ciliated included. If there's going to be, for example, let me draw it on here. If you see some tissue that actually has tiny cilia coming out the top of it, then we would have to also include ciliated as part of its name. So let's look at some examples of that. I think it'll be a little clearer once we get over to the next slide and have you practice with these. So here we have our monkey, and we have some examples of epithelial tissue for us to name. What you may want to do at this point is pause the video and see how you can do, and then when you're ready, we'll continue. So I'll pause for a couple seconds. If you're still with me, we'll start naming some of these. Okay, so when we look at this one, the easiest way to name epithelial tissue is to look for the basement membrane, if you can see one. This one's very obvious. We have a very obvious basement membrane down here. Okay, now we have to figure out how many layers it is. Well, this is one where the nuclei appear to be on different levels, but if you look carefully, and let me erase my scribble here, all of these cells actually touch the basement membrane. So it really actually is only one layer. So since it appears to be more than one layer, but it's actually only one layer, we refer to this as pseudostratified. We also recognize up here in this one, we have cilia, so we need to include that in the name. And we also have to then look at the shape of the cells. Are these cells flat-like? Are they cubes or are they columns? Okay, they look more column-like. So the best name for this cell, for this epithelial tissue would be what? Okay, hopefully you saw pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium. It's a mouthful, but it actually tells you exactly what this tissue is. Let's look at the next one. Down here we have no basement membrane, but we have a tissue that has only one cell layer to it. Okay, only one layer of cells. And these cells are more cuboidal. So this would be simple cuboidal epithelium. Very common in glands. Okay, how about down here? Okay, we have here multiple layers, right? So that tells us we're going to have stratified as part of the name. We also looking at the cell shape. Now again, don't start getting confused and saying, well, there's two different kinds of shapes. There's one here and one there. We only use the apical surface to name it. So this would be stratified columnar epithelium. About over here. Okay, lots of layers, stratified. Cell shape, squamous or flat. So that'd be stratified squamous epithelium, like we see in our skin. Down here, one layer thick, flat like cells, simple squamous. And how about here? We have one layer, simple, okay, shape of the cells, columnar, so simple columnar epithelium. So these you'll be practicing more with in lab as well, but those are good to go back to if you want to practice some more and pay attention to the number of layers and the shape of the cells. So I'm going to take me off here for a second. Oops. So let's look then at some structural and functional relationships. I don't want you to lose track of this idea that anatomy reflects physiology even at the tissue level. And by that I mean if we consider where you would find simple epithelium versus stratified epithelium, you're going to find simple epithelium in places where you need to have diffusion. You need to have you have movement from one place to another, or secretion or absorption, as opposed to stratified, where you're going to find that where you need lots of protection. You don't want to have this one layer of cells in your stomach, or one layer of cells on your skin. So think about stratification as where you're going to have lots of layers for protection. Simple is going to be more involved with diffusion and secretion. Think about squamous cells. They're flat cells. So they're probably going to be better for diffusion or filtration, whereas cuboidal or columnar cells are going to be better for secretion and absorption and protection in some cases because they're large cells. They're going to be able to secrete a lot of products because they're big cells, or absorb because they're big cells. So pay attention to anatomy reflecting physiology here. And just a couple more ideas along the same theme. Think about where you'd want to have layers, or where you'd want to have cilia, or where you'd want to have smoothness. The inside of your blood vessels, for example, will be a great place to have a smooth, friction-free surface. And one form of epithelium is called endothelium inside of blood vessels, and it's very smooth on the inside. That just makes sense. Microvilli are extensions from cell membranes, so in places where you want to have a lot of absorption capacity, you'd want to have those like in the small intestines. Cilia are going to be really good for propelling or pushing things along a surface, and we're going to find these in places like the nasal cavity or trachea. I really do not want you to go through and memorize every place in the body you're going to have pseudostratified columnar epithelium or simple epithelium. I want you to think about where they would be based upon the need at that part of the body and what kind of cell type would be best for that. Finally, we'll finish with glands. Epithelial tissue does form glands as well, and a gland is going to be a single cell or a group of cells that secretes, that produces some sort of product. And here we need to make sure we're clear on the difference. Endocrine glands are going to be glands that do not have ducts. Ducts here, not like D-U-C-K, quack, quack, D-U-C-T, tubes. So endocrine glands don't have tubes. They actually are going to secrete their products directly into the blood, and their products are hormones. So think about testes or the ovaries or part of the pancreas or the thyroid. These are going to be places where you're going to produce a hormone product and put it directly into the bloodstream. So endocrine into the blood, that's how I remember it. But we'll focus here on exocrine glands to finish up this video. Exocrine glands are going to have ducts. They're going to have little tubes that take their product from the gland into a space or a cavity or a surface. So some examples, sweat glands are one example of an exocrine gland. Even mammary glands are going to be an example. If you think about a mammary gland in terms of producing a product, it will go through a tube, appear on the surface at the nipple. That actually, by definition, would be an exocrine gland. And glands are classified in different ways by structure and by how the products leave the cell. Your book gets into some detail on this. We're not going to be as specific about branching and all the lobes and glands. I just want you to focus on the secretion types and these three. The three examples or the three types here are Merrican glands. Merrican glands are also called eccrine glands, and these are glands that when they secrete their product, no cellular material leaves the gland. That is, it's going to be pure product. And the example there are sweat glands. No parts of the cell get pinched off. Nothing really gets damaged in a Merrican gland. Apocrine glands are going to be where part of the cell gets pinched off or part of the cytoplasm leaves along with the product. And that's the example for that is going to be mammary glands. Also, we associate apocrine glands with glands that are axillary and in our pubic region. So, and we'll talk about why that they have slight odors a little bit later. Halocrine glands are going to be glands where the gland itself is actually going to be destroyed. You see here a dying cell releases the products. So these cells have to be quite mitotic to replace themselves. An example here, sebaceous glands. Hair has sebaceous glands associated with it. Sebaceous glands are glands that produce oils. So there's three different gland types depending upon how much of the cellular material is lost. Merrican, none. Apocrine, a little bit. Halocrine, quite a bit. Okay, and finally, we will move to the last tissue type we really didn't discuss. We'll focus on in class. This actually is connective tissue. We'll spend some time looking at it in detail coming soon.